Hello, welcome to the CJP podcast. Today I'm here with Elisha Breton. He's a Jew that I've met across the road of life. We actually met in elementary school at Hebrew Academy of Huntington Beach. And he's a friend of the family. We're our mishpachim, or kol echad mishpacha. We're all one family. We have Elisha over for Shabbos every so often. We have him over for the Pesach. We usually do have him over for big holidays as well. Just not happens to be this year. Anything else you want to provide to identify yourself?
No, just I miss coming to the Paul residence for Pesach this year. Your mother is an exceptional cook, and I always miss her food.
Oh, I'm really blessed with my mother and her cooking. I have no excuse ever to eat out. I do still eat all the McDonald's, all the Carl's Jr. and everything. It's about the variety. It's a variety, but there's such good quality.
It's about the animal fries, dude. It's all about the animal fries.
Mm-hmm. Good old fork and knife action in your fries, dude. Like
100%.
Like you're Canadian or from Amsterdam.
It's interesting. I've been like reverting back closer and closer to keeping kosher, so my outside meat consumption has gone down a lot. Yeah, I started wearing a kippah at my campus at Cal State Long Beach on a whim, one day, and it kind of rolled into me getting back to my more religious roots. It also kind of has to do with my classes, my Jewish studies classes.
Yeah, you gave me a little basic rundown there. You said major in Jewish studies, another double major in history and the history of the Middle East, and a minor in religious studies, which is honestly, once I heard that, I'm like, oh my God, I want to pick your brain clean on every single thing I have, So because those things also very much interest me, and I consider myself a student of history, and why do we have to make the same mistakes that are constantly in the cycle? We should learn from the past, and we should look forward from what the things we learned from the past. And I really, before we go on to your major, I really want to focus on the whole religious aspect, because that really does interest me, because I personally consider myself a religious Jew, just a bad one. I just don't practice it so well. And I do see myself in the future coming more close, maybe not to the level of modern Orthodoxy, but my level of modern Orthodox in my life, seeing what things I see important, looking at the rabbis and their arguments, and not just coming to I'm just going to have a nice life, but I'm going to have a thoughtful place where I consider myself religious.
I very much agree with you. We both went to Hebrew Academy, so we had a very strong Chabad Orthodox background. And when I left, I kind of
provide a little. For what's Hebrew Academy?
Background to a Chabad. So for those of you that don't know, Hebrew Academy is probably the premier Chabad Orthodox school in Orange County. That being said, we spend a majority of our time learning Talmud, Gemara, Chumash, Jewish history, and less time learning secular studies, math, English.
When I was there, the first half of the day was left to the religious studies, and the second half was the secular. But we're talking about early mincha is usually where the switch is, which is about probably 2/3 the religious. And why the Chabad is a sect of Judaism, which is all about the practice and do it with happiness and do your actions with happiness.
Yes, very much so.
And that's the type of place where I would say that the Chabad really molded my young mind very much into religious sphere and a religious idea, where I think it sort of pushed me away. And I think it molded my brother's mind a lot quicker than it molded my mind. And I was definitely the last on the train in my family to become that religious, but I was also the last on the train to fall out of the religious because of the nurture and the molded of the mind, me being so young, growing up in such a religious institution. It's a Chabad. It's a sect of Judaism of Ashkenazi Jews. The Rebbe, it's a part of Hasidim, which literally means Chesed, means happiness. And the Rebbe, who is the last great leader in the movement, died during the 80s. And his last message is try to convince all the Jews. The message of Chabad is not to convert non-Jews, but to get the Jews who aren't practicing what they say correctly. They should spread the message, and that's why in Orange County it's the premier Chabad. Just go more in the specific. And you had a much closer
So yeah,
relationship with the school because I believe your mother worked at, and you
my
also
mother
worked.
worked there. I worked there. I was also a student there for 10 years. Um, so my exposure to Chabad was, yeah, pretty good, not just decent. It was pretty deep. Um, and moving away from Hebrew Academy, kind of left me in a weird situation. I was only used to religious classrooms. Um, I was only used to religious learning. So when I finally moved away from that, it opened my mind quite a lot. And even though I moved from an Orthodox Jewish school to a Reformed Jewish school, I probably had the most amount of culture shock moving between Jewish schools than I did eventually moving to community college. Because
Yeah.
community college was the first time that I had ever gone to public school. Um, and since then, so that was about 5 or 6 years ago. Since then, I've had experiences that you would never believe. People who have never met Jews before, people who have asked me if I have horns, people who wonder why I wear a kippah,
Really,
people wonder where I get my name from.
really, even
Although
modern.
I will say most of that comes from community. Yes, even modern people. I will say
Modern.
that the
Can I
majority of
ask?
that has come from
Let's let's
community colleges.
let's go more in specifics. I want to hear that story, horns,
Okay.
because I know in my life of anti-Semitism, maybe an offhand joke or anything, and I've called people out, but nothing as, I guess, yeah, joking. I may be having horns, but in a joking manner. Were they in a joking manner? Where does like
Um,
horns come from? And
it
I'm
was
like, oh,
it
they're
was more
right
like
here.
like it was more like horns. Like you're a Jew. Do you have them? And I was like, no, I don't, sir. I'm sorry. Um, but
uh,
also one of the more interesting things, and to kind of lead into identity politics, like you talked about, one of the more interesting things that I've kind of dealt with at Cal State Long Beach is, um, people being uncomfortable calling people Jews, um, which is very weird. You wouldn't not call a Christian because you
oh
think it
yeah,
feels weird.
I have a
And you
personal
wouldn't,
experience with that. A story after you
right,
complete of I
and
want.
and you wouldn't not call a Muslim unless in either
Right.
of those circumstances they asked you not to. However, both Islam and Christianity don't have the same religious and ethnic distinctions that Judaism has, and apparently that has given some people who don't know their way around Judaism well enough. It's given them this kind of thought of whether or not calling someone a Jew is
I have a personal
normal.
anecdote. I went on a
Anecdote?
trip. Yeah, anecdote. Where I went on a religious trip to Utah in Zion National Park, where it was a religious group, Orthodox, modern Orthodox, where we spent a week in Zion National Park. And one of the days, we went on a day trip to one of the nearby regional parks, and we were walking. And I said, "Oh, I'm with the Jewish group." And the guy asked me, I'm like, "Oh, the Jews," and he says, "Oh, can you say the Jew?" And I'm like, "Well, that's what we are, Jewish, yeah." And there's a little sort of a derogatory colloquialism around it that
Yeah.
causes such a degree. That's what we are. You call a Jew because a Jew is a Jew. There's other words that if you want to use the derogatory, but there seems to be, you Jew is seen as negative, and that's ingrained, to say, anti-Semitism within the
Hmm.
language itself. And I agree with a lot of the political scientists, social scientists, is their premises, just not their conclusions. Their premises are based off of scientific method, sampling, biases, and samples, and they
Hmm.
do make a lot of good points. I just don't agree with the conclusions. And I do feel it, and I just don't agree with the plans they have. So, and
I agree. I think part of that comes from the lack of Jewish representation at certain levels, which comes from, in my opinion, it comes from assimilation. We've Jews in America specifically have assimilated to the point where they might not necessarily feel the need for representation,
yeah,
um,
I agree.
or they've lost their kind of Jewish identity.
I give
Um,
some metrics. 0.2% of the U.S.'s population is Jewish. 0.02% of the global population is Jewish. There's about 15 million Jews in the world, and I think 5 to 6 million of them live in America, something like that. I don't know. There's a
yeah,
very, very rough estimates. The other five, then another 7 million live in Israel, and the rest live
correct,
scattered throughout the diaspora. And
correct.
Jews in America have been treated the best ever in any history. Usually, throughout history, Jews I've known have dealt with persecution from the Spanish Inquisition to the Shoah, the Holocaust. And I think this challenge of Jews in America are much more different. And that's what I actually want to. I think it seems like this podcast is going to turn into the more of the meat is going to be actually these Jews and that, because this interests me.
Yeah.
I want to talk
Yeah.
to someone about this and more in person. Do you feel like what I'm saying is, I agree assimilation is the biggest problem facing Jews in America, but I think that stems from there's so many different ways that you can quantify Jews, either ethnically, culturally, or religiously, that assimilation is going to be a case, because I don't think ethnic Judaism means that much. That only means that much because the world make it that much. And cultural and religious Judaism is a lot more important to me than such a ethnic Judaism, because I'm not a racist. The race doesn't is not really an important factor for me.
So I feel like, okay, so I kind of need to give you some background. I have a fairly decent background, specifically in history and dealing with Jewish extremist literature. And one of the people that I've dealt with and done the most research on is Rabbi Meir Kahane.
Oh, I thought you were going to say Marx.
No.
Another great
Although
thought leader.
another great Jewish extremist, but no. I've done a lot of research on Rabbi Meir Kahane, and one of the things that Kahane said is that the Jews of America had transcended the identity of being Jewish. They no longer wanted to participate in certain things. They no longer wanted to claim certain traditions that made them Jewish. And I also need to say, by no means do I agree with everything Rabbi Meir Kahane said or did. He was.
You want to give a little
yes.
the ethos
Kahane,
behind? I don't know who. I'm not familiar with the
Meir
name.
Kahane grew up right after the end of the Holocaust. He was probably born during the Holocaust. He had very close ties with Zev Jabotinsky, who was the leader of revisionist Zionism, and another extremist Zionist who called for a state of Israel on both sides of the Jordan River. Something that Kahane also fought for.
Something I'm interested in.
Yes, the distinction is that Meir Kahane abused violence. He blew up an embassy. He tried to blow up another embassy. He was arrested several times. He was an FBI informant against the Communist Party. So he was definitely involved in a lot of extremist operations and engagements. But he really believed that American Jews, specifically the Reform and conservative movements, had transcended their Jewish identity. There was no longer a need for them to accept the traditional religious Judaism like you were talking about. And he saw that they had assimilated fully, or tried to assimilate fully, into American society. And he also blamed Reform Judaism in part for the Holocaust. I don't agree with that. But
what was the argument behind
main
that?
idea,
you can't propose something like that and not bring up the argument.
So Meir Kahane believed that specifically the Reform movement had rejected the divine ideas of Judaism, specifically that the Torah wasn't divine; it was written by a human. That was the major one. Rejection of Torah as the divine was where Meir Kahane saw the biggest problem. And he saw that most with Reform Judaism. Now, Reform Judaism went through major changes and refurbishes after the death of Meir Kahane. During Meir Kahane's life, Meir Kahane died in the late 1990s. He was assassinated by an Al-Qaeda terrorist. So going back to that. Meir Kahane believed in assimilation as the kind of downfall of all Jews. He really believed that if all Jews were to go back to Israel to accept religious Judaism, it would kind of be the catalyst for the Messiah. And
interesting.
One of the things that you always need to remember with Meir Kahane is that it was always a religious argument. Even though he was extremely well educated, he had 2 law degrees and an undergraduate degree. He was fluent in biblical and modern Hebrew, and biblical Aramaic. So extremely bright man. But he would always choose violence for the sake of religious fervor. And that's really where most
Does he see himself as like a violent
Zionists,
martyr? Was he a violent martyr that he
yes,
understand?
yes,
He's
yes,
like,
very much so.
he's like, this is not the what needs to be the best way to do it, but this is what needs to be done.
Yes,
Okay.
and for those people that are aware of Jewish history, I'll just give a brief modern Jewish history. There was a shooting in the Tomb of the Patriarchs by a Jewish terrorist named Dr. Baruch Goldstein several years ago, almost more than a decade ago, I think. And he was a very ardent follower of Rabbi Meir Kahane. And when it came after the shooting, Baruch Goldstein was killed in the attack. But after the shooting, Meir Kahane celebrated what he had done, and that
Okay.
kind of
Let me
that
let me ask you
yeah.
one question to make sure that nobody misunderstands what you're saying. Is violence the option to get the goals that we need for action? Is open violence
No,
by people? And I want to make
oh,
sure you separate yourself from that and not,
right.
because you've been saying Mayor Kahanis and his arguments might be misinterpreted as your
Right.
arguments, and I want to make sure that you separate yourself from
So,
that, because if that's my
so for
understanding of the
one,
situation.
yeah. So for one, I agree with small parts of Meir Kahane's overarching theses about the state of Israel and about Judaism. I personally do not believe in the use of violence for state building, which is a really loaded statement because
That's very loaded.
one of
I
the
might disagree with
necessary
that statement even.
right. One of most, I think most political theoreticians they would tell you that one of the necessary tools for state building is the ability to defend yourself and have a standing army to defend your borders.
And a monopoly on power.
Yes, absolutely. Monopoly of legitimate use of force.
Yes.
So Meir Kahane believed that the monopoly of legitimate use of force, combined with religious fervor, would be enough to bring about the Messiah. I do not believe that.
I actually have some questions, Doug. Do you study a little bit, maybe even like ancient Judaism? Because I know the
Yes.
Judaism we practice is rabbinic Judaism, and there were different sects of Judaism, and I often see the Reform and Conservative movement as a step back from rabbinic Judaism and morph it into more of a modern Judaism, and I do see them as legitimate in the sense of Jewishness, but not illegitimate in the sense of rabbinic-wise Judaism. And I would even agree with the state of that the divinity of the Bible isn't maybe not in question, because a lot of the stories of the Bible are ancient Mesopotamian stories and they're archetypical stories. And I learned from Jordan Peterson, maybe you've heard of him and his biblical series where he goes into the story of the Bible, that really made me fall in love with my religion. And now I even appreciate it much greater because I understand maybe Moses didn't talk to God directly, but he saw the patterns and saw the divinity in life itself. And, I see more of these archetypical stories. And just to focus my point, maybe you can explain a little bit about ancient Judaism, maybe step back from the modern Judaism, because I think we need to get
Sure.
A before we get to, where we are, K and L on the road
Yeah.
to, Mashiach.
So just basically, the modern prayer book that Jews use is not. I mean, it's old. It's old for us as Jews. It's several hundred years old, but it does not encompass the 3,500, almost 4,000-year-old tradition of Judaism. Most of rabbinic Judaism was a change from First and Second Temple Judaism, which was based around altars.
Rabbi Akiva, Rabbi Hillel, Rabbi
even before then, when the temple was still standing.
Those were the rabbis after. Those are, I think, the 100s, right? I believe.
Those who wrote the Mishnah and the Talmud after, they were the ones who created rabbinic Judaism, which was a change. We needed something to deal with the fact that we were in exile and that we no longer had the Holy Temple to give sacrifices. So what they did was they exchanged the sacrifices for daily prayers, Shacharit, Mincha, and Arvit, the morning, afternoon, and evening prayers. And that's developed into the prayers that we have today. They aren't exactly the same. They have changed over time. Even in Hasidic circles, they have changed over time.
Oh, definitely. Especially,
Um,
it's most clear in the tunes where you will see tunes across
yeah,
certain songs, psalms, PSLAMS, psalms, and other things have very similar tunes that I've recognized from going from Orthodox temples to Reform. But then then there's a wide degree. Usually, I see Enkel Kanu usually has the same
yeah.
tune, maybe a la Lenu, and it seems like
And
certain things.
for those people that are aware of modern Jewish liturgy, we have Rabbi Shlomo Carlebach to thank for most of that, who was an Orthodox Jew. I know we're kind of going back into modern times, but he was an Orthodox Jew who accepted all forms of Judaism, which is something that
Like even
isn't really.
like once I relearned like my more modern and middle Jewish history and medieval, I would guess it would be called. And I learned, well, who says I'm not talking to God directly, and I know these rabbis might
Hmm.
be wiser, but these aren't small men who created such great movements. These aren't nobodies as well. Who am I to say that
Correct.
they haven't figured some things out that I didn't figure out? And they are continuing Judaism through reform and conservatism. Yeah, I think if you look at the population of assimilation in conservative and reform are much lower, but if I'm sure if you ask those kids, do they consider themselves Jewish? I would be very curious about those polls, and maybe they see themselves as multi-religious. Maybe see the Christian.
I
And do you know if familiar with any
I
of those
also
polls?
think, yes, I also think it has to do with the degree of comfort that we've come to live in this country. You mentioned earlier that American Jews have some of the least restrictive laws since we got here, since the establishment of the
Well, it's
Jewish
not because
U.S.
being Jewish, it's because America is so great. And even if you're, I think Mormons and other religious organizations, the Amish and other Bible Belt religious Christian groups
Yes,
are dealing with the same problems. It's not just
yes.
a Jewish problem. It's just Jewishness has been ingrained in us so long. There's a reason why our religion lasted 3 to 4 thousand years. It's because of the practice, and it's just most obvious in our religion because we require so much of a burden on people, and it's so clear when they stop that burden.
So I think a lot of it has to do with the comfort of American Jews. There's no longer a need to hide your religion. There's no longer a need to hide the practice of keeping kosher. There's no longer a need to hide doing the prayers. And I think that that comfort has led to greater levels of assimilation, specifically in communities that no longer enforce those kind of Jewish norms because they're comfortable not doing them.
Mm.
And what that leads to, in my opinion, are Jewish children who do not grow up with kind of that ingrained fear of being Jewish. Now, I'm not saying this is a bad thing because I think the level of intellectual freedom that we have as Jews in this country far surpassed anything we had since we were able to rule ourselves originally
Like the
in
kingdom of
ancient
Israel.
yeah, in
Uh,
King David's time. So the
yes,
level of
and
intellectual freedom that
let's
we
make
have,
this very clear. The Jewish land is the Jewish land, and there's
yeah,
history that predates the conception of Islam itself.
correct.
Just a
Judaism
quick point.
predates Islam
Yeah,
by 2,600 years, just to
and
be clear.
the kingdom of Israel predates, I think, by 500 years. I believe I forget the exact specifics, but it
It's more
predates.
than that. So Islam was created in the year 600 CE after the death of
Uh,
Muhammad, 630.
I
Obviously,
misremembered. I
Christianity,
thought it was BC. That's why. Yeah.
yeah,
Okay.
Christianity began at the year zero at the death of Christ.
Or
And at that time, Judaism was already 2,000 years old upon the
well,
death
I
of
heard
Christ.
an interesting comment that 10% of the population of the Roman Empire at a certain point were Jews. Judea was an actual serious. It's the crossroads of Afro-Eurasia. You're telling me this point isn't important? It's
It's
literally
extremely
it's
important. And I
the
think
quote unquote
another
center of the world. Is there's a reason why they believe the world created out of it because it's the center of the actual old age world forever until
another
14
important
1500s.
yeah, another important point to make about most medieval European empires is that while they kicked out most of their Jewish residents, the Jews that lived in most of those places predated the empires that were kicking them out. Um, there were Jews in Italy before the Visigoths took over. There were Jews in Rome before the Romans took over. Um, all those barbaric empires
The
that
Gauls.
Rome fought, they were Jews in Galatia before the Gauls were there. So Jews have predated many of these ancient civilizations.
Why? Because Jews be making
Um,
moves.
so, yes, and we were also heavily involved with trading, especially on the Silk Road between Baghdad and China. There were a lot of Jews there. That's where the first Asian Jews came from, was trading between Baghdad and China
Oh, that's very
uh,
interesting. I
after
it seems
after
like
the go ahead.
I'm loving this conversation. I just want to say that I did not expect this to come of when we did our pre-podcast. Once you said your major, I was like, forget everything else I want to talk about. We can talk about that later. Let's talk about this itself. So I'm so happy that you learned this. Now let's bring it back to modern times. We talked about the history, and if you want to go into the weeds of the old history, we can. But now let's talk about
No,
history
I
of
want
the
to bring it
history of the
back.
Middle East. Oh, actually, if you want to go somewhere, I want to go in the history of the
No,
Middle
I just
East to
want
talk
to.
about a modern Israel. I want to start getting back
Okay.
to maybe
Um,
colonial times and
I
what the
will.
colonial influence.
I'll bring it back to modern Israel. I'll get
Okay,
back there in a second.
all right, you're in
I
charge
just
here.
want to touch back. I just wanted to touch back on my comment about the comfort of American Jews and kind of
Yes,
how assimilation plays into that. So, I think, like I said, due to the level of comfort of American Jews, we started to assimilate more. So, as we know, the state of Israel was founded in 1948. And at that time, there was a very large population of quote unquote Reformed Jews. They were not traditional, they were not religious, they were not interested in the religion of Judaism.
one
They
thing
were
they were though,
farmers.
Zionists.
Yes, they were Zionists. They were interested in self determination for the Jewish people, not religiously, but politically. And one of the things that really made the state of Israel in 1948, 1949, even 1947, going back a little bit, was a very important religious figure named Rav Kook, who was the first
I do
chief
recall this name.
rabbi,
Yeah.
yeah, the first chief rabbi of Israel. And once he was asked what he thought about the socialist Zionist Jews, and he said that the only way for religious Judaism to survive is for these socialist Zionist Jews to make a state of Israel, which they did, which allowed the religious Jews to continue what they were doing and to kind of learn and keep their
And it's funny. It's still so true to this day,
life.
where you
Yeah,
have religious Jews in the state of Israel enjoying the freedoms of a Jewish state and are anti-Israel and they're anti.
yeah.
It's crazy how such great rabbis of the past could figure out such obvious things that were obvious to them, but literally
Yeah.
they show themselves in the world. And this is where I gained the respect of rabbis. Is yeah, okay,
Hmm.
maybe they're studying religious arguments and everything, but they're basically lawyers of the good book.
Yes, I very much agree. And there's also, I mean, you would have gotten to it already. There's a duality of religious Jews and non-religious Jews, how we kind of play back and forth on each other.
Well,
Um,
let's actually let's focus on that duality and the bipolarism, where I do not like how religious Jews treat non-religious Jews in general.
sure.
They do look down on them. They do look, and that's I think on a skewed understanding of Judaism itself. Like I said, who says rabbinic Judaism is the Judaism? I'm sure there would have been still surviving. There's still surviving Judaism to this day, and maybe it would have got pamped out during the medieval times, but I'm not so sure. They lasted a few thousand years before. Why would say that? And I think just rabbinic Judaism showed up because rabbinic Judaism, the Shulchan Aruch, put it down in words, and that's with the invention of the printing press that just superseded all the other types of Judaism because it was literally an oral tradition. They just
Yes.
had the benefit of writing the oral tradition down.
One of the other things that I think most modern Jews are not aware of is that this was not the first time that there were sects of Judaism that were wiped out. I mean, the Dead Sea Scrolls came from a community in Qumran,
Um,
which is on the border of modern day Israel and Jordan, that were extremely radical. They had left Jerusalem, they were avoiding Roman armies. that were trying to wipe out the majority of Jews. And they essentially set up their own branch of Judaism that differed greatly from Rabbinic Judaism also. So we have a history of doing this as Jews among those more religious, less religious, etc.
You just have to think past what are Jews? Doctors, lawyers, and then the second you say lawyers, you're like, oh, then there's disagreement.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Two Jews, three opinions, very common.
Very good, because that's so good, because life is not black and white, and sometimes you're unsure.
Correct.
It's good to have multiple opinions on something, because you don't have enough of the information to be so definitive, and that's how I totally agree with the quote, and I don't think it's that bad.
Yeah. One of the things that it has led to in modern Israel is the Orthodox who don't want to serve in the army. They don't respond to the draft.
Well, I think they should be conscripted, and then, okay, they don't want to fight, fair, then you should be a nurse, you should be whatever. You tell me,
yes, so
or literally pray for the army. Do it on their terms, okay? Now you're conscripted, and you have to study in honor of the army. I know in ancient Judaism, they literally had a religious army corps that were responsible for learning on behalf of the army. Let them be the religious army corps.
Yes, that's true. There's always been a religious flair to Jewish militant activity.
It's very much like Islam. It was a Mesopotamian religion that required it.
Yes.
Center of Afro-Eurasia, you're constantly being conquered. They're from Europeans, from Asians, from Africans, and like the Kingdom of Egypt, Sea people, Phoenicians, everything. So there was military armies built into the religious. You have to think of Canaan and how we conquered the land, Yehoshua. We were not just people.
Joshua conquered the land, yes.
We were conquering people, and we, quote unquote, won it by conquering, which is a very ancient idea where who is in charge of the land? Well, he's on it with an army, so I guess he's in charge of the land.
Very much so. And then also you were talking about the influence of Mesopotamia. You have a nearly exact story of Noah compared to the Mesopotamian story of Gilgamesh, and so on and so forth. There are dozens of examples like this. But even more than that, even in the books of Daniel and Ezra and Nehemiah, you see Aramaic, which has bits of Persian and Akkadian and other Semitic languages, Syriac, all of those very interesting things.
The Abrahamic God, it's the monotheistic religion that came out of Mesopotamia. That it's literally the story of Abraham breaking down all the idols. They had many gods, and then they came up with a monotheistic way of looking at it. And monotheism took over after that. It spread like wildfire. It's a much more personal God versus having a lot of gods, and it's much easier for the mind to come up with, I believe. I have my own hypotheses about it, and that's my understanding of it's the evolution of religion, like we have an evolution of animals. It's the very same thing, evolution of thought. And we're talking about where now we change so quickly post-industrial revolution, but we're talking about actual realms of thought took generations to be molded and everything, because people use these as power apexes, as everything. Right of God to rule over. Many people think of history in a 21st century thought. No, you have to think as if you were living 2,000 years ago. And the ideas that you didn't understand weather, you didn't understand anything that had some order in it, you're going to commit yourself to, because there's so much chaos in the world, and you have to think of it in that context, and at the context of you understanding, went through the United States public school system, which gives you a basic rundown of a lot of things if you're paying attention. That's I paid attention. I think the school system was great for me. I went to the public school system from 10th grade to till graduating senior year, and also 8th grade. So I definitely I'm very happy I experienced outside of a Jewish thought before I went to community college. But I've come to these conclusions in the context of history, in the context of 4.6 billion years on our planet, in the context of animals. Like, I don't think there's
Hmm.
really any difference between us and a squirrel, except a squirrel chose a different evolutionary path. Definitely a lot less to do with a monkey that's 8.5 million years ago, like a
Hmm.
chimpanzee. And they're entering the Stone Age like we did, I think 40 million years ago, something like that.
Something
So
like that.
I'm saying I look at these things in those contexts, and a lot of things are a lot more clearer from afar. It's the good old parable of you're too close to the painting and God sees the whole picture.
Yeah.
Eh,
So one of the things that I kind of want to go off about that is professional history. One of the kind of big lenses that we look through in professional history is Friedrich Nietzsche's power theory, which in simple terms is history is written by the victor.
I like
Um,
it.
so who writes history? The people that have power. You will not hear of the history of the people that were killed or wiped out because there was no one to write their history. And also something that most people will probably be shocked by because they think history is all fact-based. Most of history was propaganda. It was propaganda for the people that won so that they would keep winning and so that their
Oh,
people would keep
definitely.
supporting them. Uh,
And by
some of the
primary
biggest examples
documents.
some of the biggest examples, Alexander the Great, nearly everything we know about him was propaganda from his own men, his own writers, I should say. Persians, the Persian Achaemenid Empire, they loved
Well,
propaganda.
I
They
would
loved
even
themselves.
I think also Alexander the Great is the idea of the great, that even if you don't like the story of Alexander the Great
Right,
and was a beneficiary thing, you can emulate him by saying, I'm trying to be the Alexander of the Great of blank our empire,
right.
the Mongol blank
And there,
our
and
empire.
and therein you prove Nietzsche's theory that the people that are powerful, the people that win these battles, are the ones who write the history books.
Hmm.
And one of the big hurdles that we try and make in professional history, especially these days, is to be totally objective. And one of the ways we are totally objective, specifically with Nietzsche's power theory, is looking at the other side, looking at the people that lost, looking at the people that didn't have
I,
people to write
a
about
really
them.
good anecdote is where were the Jews escaping the land of Egypt, and look at what the story that we came up with.
Right.
Yeah,
Um,
we got
the story that
10
we have,
plagues. Like, that's a wild story. The sea
right,
split. Those are the stories of the quote unquote victor, or the person, the tribe that's running away and was able to survive
right,
and make the history. See, we spin the story in a way that it would benefit us and our people. We weren't necessarily the victor. We were strategically retreating because we were essentially an empire within the Egypt empire, and we were separated from them,
hmm,
and that we never really assimilated, and we were literally an inside of another nation, and that's why we had to leave.
yes, yes, I agree with that. Um, so looking at history, specifically Jewish history through that lens is very interesting because a lot of the time in Jewish history we weren't the victor,
But it looks like you're
which
coming.
has led to another sort of study that is even good.
You just went in and out like a robotic there for a second, so if you want to re-say the last 10-15 seconds
Yeah.
again, that would be okay, and I'll let you know if it is. If not, we should pause the recording and try to do another recording and see, break it up into
Okay.
2 recordings.
So what I was saying was this kind of power theory is really important for Jewish history because in most cases we weren't the victor. In most cases we were kicked out. We
Mm.
lost lives. We lost wealth and money, which kind of leads to an interesting question of who wrote our history. And the answer is we did. Why did Jews get so good at writing our own history? And that is because we've experienced more genocide than anyone else, and I
Mm-hmm.
know that that is a
Le
lot.
door vador.
Right. So you can count going back every generation the atrocities that were faced to the
Like,
Jews
you
that
never
lived there.
expect a Spanish Inquisition, you know? Why
Right. The
why
Spanish
is
Inquisition,
why
which was followed,
why is Sephardim all
which
over the
was
Middle East? Because Sephard literally means Spain, and there's Spanish
yes,
Jews that
and how
were
how
diaspored out.
this Yeah, and then 100 years after the Spanish Inquisition was the Portuguese Inquisition in
Mhm.
1592,
And
right?
even Jews today can go to Portugal, and they prove, if you can prove that you were
Yes,
relation into them, they will give you a Portuguese passport and an apology, which is
yes.
very interesting.
And then after Portugal in the 16 and 17 and 1800s, you have pogroms in Eastern and Western Europe. So thousands, and if not more than thousands, millions, questionably, of Jews have been killed
Do you
throughout
have I
time.
have a guess why, and I think it's because of our religion, how we practice it, is why we
Very
actually
possible.
we separate ourselves from the other. Literally, look at the word goy, which is like other in a negative connotation,
Mhm.
which is I think that's why. And like, there's a reason why we're called rats, is because it's so hard to get rid of rats. Like, we're very resilient people, and I think
Yeah,
there's a literally there's anti-Semitism is there for a reason. It's not acceptable. It shouldn't be there. Racism is not good. Prejudice is not good for
I
no
agree.
reason. And I do that doesn't mean you shouldn't look at the reasons why, so we can fix our people. We're the next generation of Jews, and we should figure these things
Yeah.
out so we can fix the problems of the world. And I think Elisha here is the way he's studying, the way he's going. I think Elisha could have a good go at it, and I'm hoping that I can help along the way.
I mean, hopefully together we can come to something. I've always said that someone much smarter than me will figure out the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, even though I've spent my whole life studying
Jared
it. And
Kushner.
I doubt it'll be Jared Kushner. I
uh,
tried to read through the Middle East peace plan.
it's the best one I've ever seen, honestly. Why? Because it acknowledges
It,
the state of Israel.
yeah, it has. It certainly has. It has good points. It also has some points that I don't think are ever truly manageable. Um,
I'll be honest, I
which
don't
is
know. Let's actually circle this conversation to more modern Judaism. And if you want to finish your point first on the assimilation of America, let's finish that one off before we go into the Middle East.
so my last points on the assimilation of America. Jews in America are very comfortable. We don't have the kind of existential threat of tyrannical governments hanging over our head. And it's been like that for about 3 generations now. And I
Hmm.
think the identity of American Jews has changed because we
Hmm.
no longer have that threat over our head. We also have the promise of the state of Israel, so that if, God forbid, anything happens, we have some place to go.
Oh, that's
Um,
so true. I
I
tell you,
think,
in my life and my labels, I consider myself an American before I say
mhm,
Jew. And that's not because of America, like nationalism, but American patriotism. And I define those differently. The idea of Western liberalism, the idea of John Locke, Rousseau, Burke,
mhm,
these, the thought leaders of Western liberalism, the idea of
mhm,
Christianity, which is an offshoot of Judaism. It was a sect of Judaism
mhm,
that gained a lot of fire. And that mixed with reason, the thought of Rome, or more like closely to Greek thought, I would say more Greek thought. And that mixture I obtain more closely than my Jewishness, but that doesn't mean Jewishness is not that thing. And I do actually see the state of Israel as a second home, but like a summer property, dude. Not like
okay,
I'm not ready to give up on America, because I think America and the goals of Jewishness is less important than the goals of humanity. And I find the goals of humanity as more personal than the goals of Jewishness, because I don't like the idea of separatism. And I'm still not so convinced about the tribal things. And I haven't heard it really. I understand a good argument for staying in a tribe as long as we operate with non exclusivity besides moral exclusivity. I'm just
so I can,
I'm someone who's considered myself a religious Jew, and I'm dealing with the same problems. I see myself as an American Western liberal first, and I always wonder if dissect my brain, Alicia, figure me out, because I can't figure it out. I've been dealing with these
so,
same mental problems in my head of Jewishness and Westernness at the same time.
so I'll kind of bring this all back to hold on, I've got to sneeze.
Oh, Corona! Oh my God, you just gave me
Oh
Corona!
my God,
Oh my
I
God,
gave him
Corona!
Corona.
He gave me
From
Corona, guys.
Anaheim to Irvine, I sneezed
Anaheim
through the
over
microphone.
over the mic. Ooh, Damn, now I
15
want to get
miles away.
Okay, so figure out my labels. Because I'm still, bless you. I'm still worrying about my labels, and those are things I haven't figured out. But I'll tell you one thing that's winning that battle, and that's Western liberalism. And I see myself as much more a
So
classical liberal than a Jew. That's for sure.
here's my take on that. I've had several professors kind of ask, are there any dual citizens in the class? If so, raise your hand. And we have a smattering here and a smattering there in these different classes. The next question, almost all the time, is, do you identify as an American first? And some do and some don't. And even among Americans, some do and some don't. They identify with their grandparents' nationality, with their parents' nationality. Their parents came from somewhere else, but they were born in America. I always raise my hand, and I have to say, I don't identify as an American first ever. I don't identify as an Israeli first ever.
I identify as an Israeli zero, more of the Jewish state
Okay.
I identify with, because modern
Okay.
Israel, I see it as a political body no more than anything, and they just happen to wear the same, they just happen to also have the yellow armband if you're gonna do it in more show
Right.
terms, and that's how I see the nation of Israel is a byproduct of the Shoah, and I think it would have been around, just it would have been a much different fight without the Shoah, because I think the Zionist would have came up on top, and I would maybe even say the Zionist be a true size of Israel, even larger Israel, if the Zionists were in charge.
I'm not sure I entirely agree, but I think that's a conversation.
I'll give an example for you. Think of Hebron. Literally, my namesake, Kalev,
Yeah.
his city was Hebron, and I see that just as much of Israel. But I understand in a modern world, Hebron is probably never, it's going to be maybe a shared city, but it would never be an actual Jewish city. And I identify more.
It will never be a Jewish city again. It will never be a Jewish city again. Because prior to 1929, Israel was entirely Jewish.
I should have been more
entirely Jewish.
Yeah, and it's very interesting.
Hold on, I kind of need to go back. My mom is an Israeli citizen, so I sometimes have a tendency to identify with. I agree with you here with Israel as the political body. But in class, I always have to raise my hand and tell them that I identify as a Jew first,
really?
before Israeli or American or anything else. I'm a Jew first.
Do you identify as American before an Israeli?
I don't identify with a national identity most of the time. I identify as a Jew.
What about Western liberalism? Because that's the first thing I identify with is like personal autonomy, Western liberalism, that idea first. I don't have a very good word over it. Maybe classical liberal is probably the best word that you can give to it. I've came across. But that idea I identify with first above everything else.
I do agree with the concept of classical liberalism. I think it very much has its strings into Zionism, where Jews ask for self-determination. The part of my Jewish identity is to be self-determining over myself, and that kind of throws a cog into some people's identity politics, where people want to be as intersectional as possible. Well, they want to be like an American, Israeli, this, that, the next thing. I think I personally take it. I step back. I'm a Jew. People have hated Jews long enough that it's the only thing I need in my identity for people to know who I am. My identity as a Jew, disregarding where I live in the world, will always be the strongest identity I have. And I know a lot of Jews won't agree with me, but that's just the way I was raised, and the kind of how you talked about the way Chabad kind of shaped your mind and stuff like that. That's really where my Jewish education took me, is that the identity of a Jew is first and foremost in my brain, and everything else is second.
Interesting. I've listened to, maybe your rabbis were better than my rabbis. I thought we had the same rabbis. It just, they convinced me not enough before the great works of John Locke. I didn't even read the great works, but like the summaries of John
Main
Locke or so, like the bridge versions did, and
uh, I find those abridged versions to
excerpts.
be extremely helpful, but
I've read
I al-
excerpts and abridged versions, never the full things, and that's just
I also
because
find
life
that
is too short, and I got the conclusion. What am I wasting my time on?
I also personally, just personal academics, I don't read the stuff that most people read. In fact, I try and avoid pack like herd logic. In that sense, I try and do the readings that most people aren't doing. I want to learn different theories than
For a
the
historian,
mainline.
though, you would have a different outlook because you're trying to actually do the
Yes,
history and
for
relay in the history. Where I'm
as
trying
a
to learn
historian,
from
it
it.
plays.
I'm
Yeah, as
trying
a
to,
historian, it
yeah.
plays to my objective side. But I don't know which direction you're taking it. But if you're not taking the historical route, I very much follow what you're saying as far as linear understanding.
I'm taking it from the, I want to learn from history. I enjoy history as a hobby as well, but I look at history as a book in human thought. We don't have a multiple universes where you can test certain ideas, but we have history as is a form of comparative politics, I would say. Like
So I
comparative
think
cultures, comparative whatever you want to call it, but mostly comparative politics. And like I said, I'm very niches power dynamics is a great way to look into history, and if you do that in with also, it really did clear up my history.
yeah. One other thing is oh shoot, what was I gonna say? Wow, this is really
Well,
sad.
let's say you're a Jew before anything else. You're a Jew of a
Right.
nation. Jew is for Israeli before American, and I didn't get exactly where you were on the Israeli and the American side because based of our understanding, I thought you were very pro Marines, very whatever. This is
I
however.
am. I'm pro. So going back to that, I am pro America. Why am I pro America? Because we have self determination here. We have a military that allows us to read and learn and teach what we want. We have teachers who are educated in any number of subjects and who can teach you. That being said, there are also problems with the system. I find, especially with education, the necessity for educational reforms. Um, in in specifically through the lens of modern learning habits with younger kids. Um,
Learning, dude. I'm a modern learning. I'm just any kid that grew up during the internet. I don't know how they sit through class unless they're actually interested in it. They're addicted to
yeah,
stimuli. I'm so addicted to stimuli. I'm just happy I find that those things interesting is why I paid attention to class because I found the subject material interesting. Besides math, where that was probably my weakest class, is because that math was boring for me. I just I'm worried about the future of our children, and I think
I agree, and I think going
uh,
back to Judaism, one of the things that Jews have always prided themselves in is their academic habits.
oh, definitely.
Um,
There's a reason why
so
there's Jews have a stereotype of doctors and lawyers, of
yes,
accountants. It's because it's built into our religion that if there's two things a father has to teach his children or he's failing, one is how to swim, and number two is to teach them the Torah. And Torah means you have to be literate. And for thousands of years, being literate made you a step above for everybody else. Now we live in times where literacy is very high, but that
yeah,
doesn't mean it's still not ingrained in our culture. That where's your homework? The Jewish mother nagging you, the Jewish grandma nagging you. How's the schooling? Are you a doctor yet? All these things.
exactly. I very much agree with all of those. Um, and that's part of what I love as a historian. I know a lot of people look at history and they see it as very boring, but personally, I find a lot of interest in it. So what I was going to say before that I forgot was like history, the subject of history. Um, you had asked me before the podcast why we tend to
Maybe
repeat
the
things.
field of history
Right.
as a
And
career, the field.
so we'll call it professional history.
Okay.
Why, if professional history is so good, why do we have the same issues as humans over and over and over again. And I think it's because of the lack of professional history. Um,
I would say it's because
Professional
people are
history,
people, and
that too, that too, and people don't learn from their mistakes. But it also, this kind of ties in with education and professional history, and the fact that and the power theories is that before professional history had a strong push to be objective, history was always amateur. It was done by someone who did something else professionally, and history was their side gig.
their passion.
So that plays a lot into Nietzsche's power theory. Who were the people that had the ability to do amateur
Oh,
history work?
definitely.
Well, they had to be wealthy. Because you weren't making money doing history. You had to be wealthy. You had to know languages. Who knew languages? The elite educated class, who also happened to be white and Christian for a very long time.
At least
And
since the
all three of
Industrial
those,
Revolution.
yes, and all three of those things play heavily into power theory. The history is written by select
Because
people who are writing
yes,
select stories about select types of people.
well, I say
What-
to a certain degree because there's always been throughout history public works of like the big public universities like Library of Alexandria, the great works that were kept alive because of Arabia and the Golden Age. Where I think
Sure.
my view of history, where I learned in a very step back to world history, AP, US history, and through hundreds of hours, probably videos online of me is looking at stuff or documentary-esque stuff as the
Mhm.
things I find interesting is it seems like most generations make the world 5 to 10% better about where, yes, the people learn some stuff, but they can only absorb so much. And it's either great people to propel us forward or propel us back. And yes, I do believe in the great man's theory of history, where yes, because people are malleable, we're quite malleable. And I do not think that by default we're going to or on the short term, we're not going to by default get better. We could revert and think, I think in general, if you look at it in the context of billions of years, yeah, we're going to progress. And that's a very
Mhm.
interesting worldview. I think life is inevitable. I think Western liberalism is inevitable. Uh, why? Because improbable events are a statistical guarantee with enough time. But that doesn't mean you can't have long swaths of history of 1984. I definitely see 1984 as more and more possibility in a modern history where the growth of the tech company, the growth of the power of government, everyone's so more involved in your life. The second we start doing biomechanics and bioengineering our brain, they're going to even be closer to us. And I don't think, and I want our generation, I think you might still be considered a millennial or a Zoomer, but our under 20, under 30 people, let's make the world 100% better this generation. Let's not go for 10 or 20%. Let's go for the whole bang and let's solve a bunch of our world issues. We're in an influx point where it can go either really bad or really good, and we're running out of time to choose which one. And
I 100% agree with you, and I just think more people of our age need to step up into the world. Honestly,
look, I
need
just
to,
started this podcast 4 days ago and have
yeah.
4 people on so far.
So I guess one of well, we can call this a closing thought or a thought for next time. Um, One of the kind of off branches of things that I've studied is an area of science called transhumanism. And transhumanism is the assumption that someday humans and computers will come together. Essentially,
Uh,
in layman's terms, cyborgs. We will become cyborgs.
I
Um,
think it's inevitable, and we
and
have to.
transhumanism is the acceptance of this and how we will change uh, culturally, genetically, all the changes that will occur. Transhumanism is the acceptance of this next level of genetic theory almost.
Well, we're already. I've heard Elon Musk made a point that we are already cyborgs. The second we have phone at our hip, we're cyborgs. We just don't have a good enough, close enough interface where we can actually operate. There's a bottleneck effect, and the second that we do merge our brain to a cyborg system, we have to because we're going to create artificial intelligence, and they will outcompete us. So we
Right.
buy a species we have to become cyborgs, or we're going to be outcompeted by other things that we create. And I rather continue being the apex predator at the top of the food chain. I don't know about you, but we're talking about
So
100 years, 200 years probably.
yeah.
I say about, my guess is 2075. I want to, probably in my lifetime. I'm excited that I just want to live long enough that they can upload my conscious to something, and not like, I mean, take my conscious and move it, not make a copy of it. I want to live for as long as possible. And once you're on an online system, you can control time by itself. So if you're like, oh, you really want to live forever? Well, no, I'm a computer now, so I can.
So I will say, if people are interested in this, I can recommend some reading material. The
I
first
think
one,
we talked
the
about a
first
bunch
one,
of heavy stuff, and let's use this
yeah.
as a closing thing, as looking into the future and what are the
So
wild ideas about the future.
yeah.
Because I think we
So
had a
looking,
good long, and I do want to go back to the Middle East and talk about the Middle East and a modern Israel more deeply
okay,
in another podcast, because at this point, this is the most fun I had on my podcast so far. Last
oh,
podcast with Yosh was great. I enjoyed it too bad. And look at this. Like I said, let's top it, and I think we did. So
we did
let's finish off with some
some
transhumanism,
recommendations for the
some
future.
100 years, 200 years, 50 years, 10 years. Let's take some guesses and see, when we look back at this video, see how right we were and how wrong.
So for people that are interested in kind of fictional transhumanist theory, Dan Brown, who is the author of the notorious Angels and Demons, or the Da Vinci Code, also has another book called Origin, which delves a lot into transhumanist theory, which I greatly recommend. I think it's a great book. Second, I
Okay.
recommend
Okay.
a series on Netflix actually called Altered Carbon, which
I
kind
did
of
watch
takes,
that.
yeah. So it's adapted from a trilogy by the author Richard K. Morgan, and basically the short synopsis is that they figured out how to download into the human brain into small, they're called stacks, and they go in the back of your neck, and it kind of the
Pick
whole trilogy deals with AIs and what
class
happens if you get
warfare, class dynamics. It creates a superhuman class.
exactly.
I enjoyed the first season. I'm still at the end of still muddling my way through the second season, because I really enjoyed the first season because it was a period piece sort of, that
Yeah,
was sort of I didn't like it turned into like a terrorist. Basically turned into a terrorist romance novel
yeah.
show, and I didn't.
I do highly recommend the books, though. The books have much better plot lines as far as the class struggle, class theory, dealing with humans being updated into different bodies. Going back to the Middle East, that is one place where transhumanism is going to struggle. You've got huge like hardline Islamists in several places in the
I
Middle
want
East.
to talk about Islam. I think the problem with Islam is that they still haven't had the Great Schism, because it's a very new religion, where the Christianity had a Great Schism of the Catholic Church and Martin Luther. What is that, in the medieval times? I think that's
Yeah, you've got Martin
1300s, right?
Luther,
Was
and
that
then
the
Henry
1300?
VIII.
Henry VIII, and then even more
Exactly.
recently John Smith
Yeah,
with Mormonism.
Protestant Revolution, Catholic or not Catholic, Lutheran Revolution, Protestant Revolution, Mormon Revolution.
You have a
Uh,
bunch of them, and I think Jewishness also had that with
Judaism has
conservative.
had many great schisms between Hasidim and McNagdim, between the
But
Jews who
and I
discovered
think it's
in
also really
Jerusalem.
important to say Jews are one of the few religions where you can go to heaven while not being Jewish, and that
Yeah,
made us like we never. There's very few sects of Judaism that were actually militant, like you said, that were conquering Jews, and
yeah,
the conquering, at least in the history of Judaism, the conquering was probably two times. Once in uh, the kingdom of Israel, and the story, the actual Bible story of taking over the Israel, and the story of Yehoshua and the falling books. But more recently in the Zionist movement, I think,
hmm
even by, like, if you want to use quote unquote modern context of the right of Israel, first you have the biblical. We've mentioned Jerusalem 900 times in the Bible, 600 by the word Jerusalem, like another 300 by the word Zion. And if you want to use modern context, is where right by conquest, dude. How many wars did Israel win against neighbors that try to take their land?
A
I don't.
lot.
I don't even think the other arguments are necessary. But if you want to, they have a right by heritage. We have a right by all sorts of ways that we could definitely. I want to have another podcast to look more specifics on the Middle East, but I just want to more focus on the transhumanism now, so we don't take up all the major points of next.
So I think there are religious strongholds in the Middle East that will kind of prevent maybe transhumanism from
I'm not so
happening
worried about
too
that
close to
because
our time period.
the second you get one transhuman, I have an idea that I've been working about the great apes theory of maybe the modern hallucination. How did our brain develop so quickly, so fast? I think we self-selected for it probably that quick, and I don't think it was that quick. As soon as you have an ape able to get at the bone marrow, he's eating healthier, and all the other apes are going to replicate it. I think it's the same case with probably a human. The second you have one human out competing all the other humans, literally playing a video game, boom, bop, pow, with aim assist on, those militant holdoffs are going to straight go on, okay, maybe this whole thing is, I think it would force actually a schism in. I'm not really so worried.
I think I will kind of leave you with this question. And that is the historical thought of drugs. How drugs played a theory in evolution, or what part drugs played in evolution. Because there are many religious theoreticians who see prophecy, especially among the major prophets, as bouts of mushrooms or early acid.
Just look at the halo of the crown. It's supposed to be a mushroom, according to some people.
And there are some people who identify with a lot of Muhammad's prophecy as being mushroom trips. There's a lot of consistencies there too. So yeah, I guess, why is this all important? Why is religion important?
Well,
I'm gonna try and.
It sounds like you didn't listen to my other podcast, because that's what I do. And at the end of every podcast is, what did I learn from this podcast and why is it important?
Well, I think it's more than what I learned from this podcast. It's kind of one of my overall theories about Judaism, of why it's so important.
Oh, give us the big why. Let's hear it.
I think all of this is so important because we're human, because we make mistakes. All of these things that we try and do are in an effort to kind of match this perfect human that no one's ever met before. Perfect in religion, perfect in practice, perfect in politics. We are aiming for perfection where there has never been perfection. And I think the reason that is important is because we are human and we make mistakes by design.
We're animals.
Yeah, and that's a point that you've made several times this podcast, is that we are designed to be flawed. And we need to give ourselves some room to flaw.
But what matters is that you're 1% better every single day. Okay, the numbers are arbitrary, but not compare yourself to others. Compare to yourself to you, who you are today and who you were yesterday. And those are the contexts you give. So that's a very great major point. I want to say, all the podcasts we have a lot to talk about next podcast, but this is definitely was great. I loved it. What I've talked about was things I wrote down that I learned from this podcast is first, identity. You gave me a definitely new look at looking at my Judaism, my Jewish identity, but I definitely still probably on the Western liberalism. Maybe I'll consider Jewish before American. I'm not sure, but I would have to definitely relook at my life on that one with your challenge of identity. I liked how power. I definitely did look at history and the power dynamics of Nietzsche, and I think that's a very important point. And I looked at Jewish history in some metrics, but you definitely have a much better knowledge base of Jewish history than I am, and you definitely reverted my aim on that that side, and definitely professional history versus amateur history and the shift at a certain point. I really enjoyed the great philosophers and like what type of stuff they were in, because they weren't just philosophers, they were historians, they were literally professional smart people. That's what their job was. They were the mathematicians. They figured out the aqueducts. They did literally all of the above. They literally committed their life to the betterment of humanity. And I think we should probably bring that back. We fell too far into specialization due to our modern world.
I very much agree. I very much agree. And that, I think I'm going to think more on that. I like that thought.
Do you want anything to finish off before I give my final goodbyes? Any major points you want to leave? You challenged the
I know
role of
it. I know I
psychedelics
talked a lot
in religious thought, but do you
in
want to
religion.
any other
Yeah.
specifics that you want people to finish off?
Uh, not specifics, but just kind of like an overall caution. I know a lot of the things that I talk about are very out there. They're very conceptual, and they definitely stray on the edges of what is accepted in modern historical acceptance, right? Extremist work by Jabotinsky and Kahana is very questionable among Jews. Transhumanism is extremely questionable among geneticists. So but I also follow my own path. I said that I don't read into the major works. I always look for the stuff that isn't touched very much. So I stay fairly consistent. But my caution here is um, uh, I'm a historian. I read into a lot of these things. I don't necessarily believe in every single one of them, especially the more violent extremist ones. I just find them incredibly interesting because of their historical perspective.
Partially,
And
people look too much at the actual point, not the actual point, the meta of the point. I think
right,
people need to get better at looking at the meta of things and not just the actual thing. And that's what I want to stress so much in this podcast. You can learn from anything, and maybe not from the thing, but the meta of the thing you can learn. Why all it's quantum theory, it's all the things that it's not, as well as what it is.
right. So I urge people, if you want to do more research into any of the topics that I've talked about, I have my own writing on them. Feel free to reach out and I will give it to you. But also, if you want to do
Oh,
your own
definitely.
research, if you want to do your own research into any of these, just do it with a grain of salt. Take into consideration that these are, in general, extremist theories. But I want to thank you for inviting me on to talk about some of them.
Oh, definitely. I think we should have another podcast in a week or so when I get more things so I can break you up into the whole mix. But at a certain point, once I get down all of the basic general ideas, I want a current events podcast as well. And we can look at the world in your professional historian point of view. And I think that's very important that we should not only look at the world in a public, I should have a doctor on and talk about Corona. I should have a economics and talk about Corona. And we could definitely talk about that later and see what big is, but I think that's a good way to end it. Or if you're a challenge, I think it's important for people to think and actually think deep thoughts. Be the thinker there. We have more than enough time than ever. Put down the Netflix show for a little bit. Okay, maybe grab a glass of wine. Maybe put on some nice music or whatever. But actually think about these things and think. You'll act better once you think. I believe
I
so.
agree. I
That's where
agree.
we'll end it. Let's
Sounds
end it
good.
on that one challenge to think. And I will say, have a good one and stay healthy.
You too, man. Happy Passover.